The wind swept over the prairie like a restless ghost, carrying with it the scent of dust, sagebrush, and something lonelier still. It was the kind of afternoon when a man's thoughts turned inward, and a young cowboy riding across that endless flat country might wonder if the trail he'd chosen would ever lead him to anything resembling a home. He was no more than 21, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen more death than he cared to count. The cattle trails had raised him, the saloons had hardened him, and yet his heart still clung to a hope he could not put into words. His horse, a lean bay mare with scars along her flank, carried him steady toward the far horizon where a town shimmered in the haze, a town he did not yet know would change everything. The widow was already there. Her house sat on the edge of Dry Creek, a small clapboard structure surrounded by failing fences and an orchard that had gone wild since her husband's death 2 winters before. She was no stranger to hard work, nor to heartbreak. Once she had come west with dreams of building a life carved from the stubborn land. Dreams shared with a man who believed his rifle and his sweat would be enough to beat back the wilderness. But the wilderness had taken him. An ambush, an outlaw's bullet, blood staining the snow before her eyes. Since then, she had worn her grief like armor. The townsfolk called her the Widow Harper, never by her Christian name, as though widowhood had swallowed up everything else she had been. Yet beneath her black dresses and measured silences lived a woman of fire, a woman who dared not let anyone close enough to see the embers still glowing inside. When the young cowboy rode into town, dust rising behind him, the widow was at the general store, trading eggs and a small sack of beans for lamp oil. She caught his figure out of the corner of her eye, a tall boy in a sun-bleached hat, his stride loose but uncertain, the kind of gait that spoke of too many nights under the stars and too few spent in safety. She told herself not to look again, but she did. He noticed her too. "The hook, is your mind always on what's under my skirt?" The words came later, but their spark began here in that first glance. For though she said them sharp, laced with irony, they carried a tremor of something deeper. Not flirtation, not exactly. More like challenge. More like testing whether this young drifter could stand in the fire she carried with her. That evening, as dusk laid lavender shadows across the prairie, the cowboy found himself outside the widow's fence, not because he had planned to, but because fate or maybe something hungrier had led him there. He had been asking around town for work. The livery had no room. The saloon keeper offered only dirty coin and dirtier company. But someone had mentioned the Harper place, and the whisper that the widow might need a strong back to mend her fences and drive her stray cattle back from the arroyo. He stood at her gate, hat in hand, heart thumping in a way it never did when staring down the barrel of a gun. He knocked. She opened the door, lamplight softening her stern face. She looked at him, then at his horse, then back again. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low, cautious. "Work," he said. "Just a day or two if you've got it. I can mend, I can haul. Won't ask for more than a fair meal." Her eyes narrowed, but she studied him long, as if trying to read what lay beneath the dust and youth. Finally, she stepped aside. "Come in, then." Survival the first days were measured in silence and labor. He hammered new posts, stretched wire, hauled water. She cooked, said little, but watched. The land was unforgiving. Hot winds by day, coyotes by night, a storm that rolled in without warning and nearly tore the roof from the barn. Yet the young cowboy did not complain. One night after supper, she found him on the porch staring at the horizon. "Storms don't scare you?" she asked. "No, ma'am," he said. "But loneliness does." Something in her chest tightened at that. She almost sent him away right then, for loneliness was the one companion she had accepted as her own, and she feared what would happen if she tried to banish it. But instead, she sat beside him, and together they listened to the wind. Justice and shadows. The town was not safe, though. Not since Jake Moran and his gang had drifted back across the territory. They were men without conscience, men who lived by the gun and preyed on widows, ranchers, and anyone too weak to stand against them. The widow had reason to fear them most of all, for it was Moran's bullet that had taken her husband. When the young cowboy learned this, something in his eyes changed. "Then it's not just work keeping me here," he said, jaw tight. "It's justice," but she shook her head, voice sharp. "Justice. Don't talk to me of justice. The prairie doesn't care about justice. It only takes." Still, she saw in him a fire she recognized, a stubborn refusal to let the world harden him entirely. The skirt, the remark came one evening when tension between them, unspoken for days, finally cracked. He had been fixing a loose shutter, sweat running down his back. When she stepped outside, skirts brushing the dust, he caught himself staring, not lewdly, but with a hunger he could not hide. She noticed. "Is your mind always on what's under my skirt?" she said. Words sharp as a knife, but her lips curved in something dangerously close to a smile. His face flushed. He tipped his hat, stammered, "No, Mom, only sometimes." And she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 2 years. Transformation over the next weeks. Something shifted between them. The widow, once iron-willed and untouchable, found herself softening at his presence. The young cowboy, once rootless and restless, found himself longing not for the horizon but for this small ranch, this fragile chance at belonging. But fate was not done with them, because Jake Moran had returned, and with him came the promise of blood, vengeance, and a reckoning neither the widow nor the cowboy could escape. The wind did not lie. It carried across the empty plains a sound that was not just wind, the faint drum of hooves, the far echo of laughter that wasn't joy but menace, the warning that a man's past sins had found his trail again. The widow Harper heard it first as she worked the orchard, her hands raw from pulling weeds among the stubborn roots. She froze listening, and though no rider was yet in sight, her heart knew. Jake Moran was near. The young cowboy came from the barn, shirt open at the collar, arms browned from days in the sun. He caught her standing still as stone. "What is it?" he asked. She pressed her lips tight, eyes scanning the horizon. "Death if we're not careful." The boy, though she knew by now he was more man than boy, set his jaw. "Then we'll be careful. And if careful's not enough, we'll be ready." The gathering storm days passed with tension stretched thin as barbed wire. The widow moved through her chores briskly, but her eyes carried shadows. She cleaned her husband's rifle, though she said nothing of it. The cowboy pretended to focus on mending the last of the fences, yet he kept his revolver on his hip even when hammering posts. The town felt it too. Whispers spread along Main Street like brushfire. The Moran gang was raiding ranches to the south, rustling cattle, setting fire to barns, leaving bodies for the buzzards. Men gathered in the saloon, blustering about forming a posse, but none were eager to stand in front when the shooting began. One evening, the widow and the cowboy rode together into town. She needed flour and sugar. He needed nails and kerosene. As they tied their horses, silence fell among the townsfolk who had been lingering on the boardwalk. Eyes turned toward them, some curious, some pitying, some fearful. Mrs. Haldeman, the storekeeper's wife, whispered just loud enough to be heard. She ought not to take him in. Too young, too foolish. She'll lose him the way she lost the other. The widow's back stiffened, but she did not reply. The cowboy, hearing, felt a heat rise in his chest. He wanted to shout, to defend her honor, but she caught his eye with a look that said, "Don't. They don't matter." But to him, she mattered, more than he dared admit. Late-night confessions that night, after the chores were done and the house lay wrapped in stillness. The widow found herself unable to sleep. She lit a lamp and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flame. The cowboy came in quietly, barefoot, his hair mussed from tossing on his bedroll in the loft. "Can't sleep either?" She shook her head. "Too many ghosts." He hesitated, then sat across from her. "You ever tell anyone what happened?" "That night your husband." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him to leave it alone, but something in his steady gaze undid her. So she told him, halting at first, then in a flood. The ambush on the ridge, the snow falling thick, the flash of gunfire, her husband crumpling into her arms. The way Jake Moran had looked at her afterward, not with regret but with hunger, as if she were spoils to be claimed. When she finished, her hands were trembling. She hated that he saw it. The cowboy reached across the table, covered her hand with his. "You lived," he said. "That's more than he deserves. And if Moran comes for you again, he won't get past me." Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You're just a boy," she whispered. He squeezed her hand. "Maybe. But I'd die a man before I let him touch you." She drew in a sharp breath, torn between fear and the dangerous warmth unfurling in her chest. The skirt again, 2 mornings later. As dawn painted the prairie in pale gold, she stepped onto the porch with her skirts lifted slightly to avoid the dew. The cowboy was saddling the mare, and his eyes, traitorously, fell to the glimpse of her ankle pale against the hem of black fabric. She caught him looking. "Still your mind on what's under my skirt?" she asked, not cruelly this time, but softer, almost teasing. His face flushed, yet he didn't look away. "Ma'am, I'd be lying if I said no." She let the silence stretch, then said, "Maybe one day I'll let you earn the right to look, but not with the shadow of Moran hanging over us." He swallowed hard, nodded. "Then I'll send that shadow back where it belongs." The first strike trouble came before noon. They heard the gunshots from the ridge, sharp and echoing. Cattle bawled, dogs barked, and the widow's heart dropped. The cowboy ran for his horse, rifle in hand. She followed, her own rifle cradled against her shoulder. Together they crested the hill overlooking the lower pasture. 3 riders were there, driving her cattle toward the creek. One wore a red bandana she recognized instantly. One of Moran's men. The cowboy didn't hesitate. He fired, dropping the rustler from the saddle. The others wheeled and returned fire. Bullets hissed past them, one splintering the fence post inches from the widow's head. She fired back, steady and unshaken, clipping another rider's arm and sending him fleeing. When the smoke cleared, one rustler lay dead, another vanished over the ridge, the last wounded and scrambling away. The cattle scattered, but most remained. The widow turned to the cowboy. His face was pale, his chest heaving, but his eyes burned with fierce light. "You've killed before," she said softly, not as a question. He nodded once, on the trail in Texas, but never for something that mattered like this. And she understood. This was not just survival for him. This was choosing her, choosing this place. Temptation and restraint. That evening, after the dead man was buried beyond the orchard and the horses secured, they sat in the kitchen with whiskey between them. Silence pressed heavy. The widow looked at him across the table, his face drawn with weariness and something else. Desire, barely restrained. She reached for her glass, but her hand trembled. "You should leave," she whispered, his brow furrowed. "Leave? Before it's too late. Before Moran comes. Before—" She faltered. "Before what?" He pressed. "Before I fall in love with you," she almost said. But instead, "Before you end up in the ground like him." His hand brushed hers again, firmer this time. "I'm not him, and I don't plan on leaving you alone." For a moment the room seemed to tilt toward something inevitable. Her leaning into his touch, him closing the space between them. But she pulled back, breath sharp. "Not yet," she said, voice breaking. "Not while the past still rides." Foreshadowing the reckoning, the days that followed were uneasy peace. The cowboy worked the land as if it were his own. The widow watched him with a heart she could no longer deny. But always on the horizon, there lingered dust trails, signs of riders waiting, watching. In town, word spread that Moran himself had been seen near the river, drinking with his men, boasting that he'd finished what he started years ago. The sheriff, old and tired, muttered about gathering a posse, but no one believed he'd stand against Moran when the time came. The widow knew then. Their home, their fragile bond would not survive unless they faced him head-on. And the cowboy knew it too. One night, as the stars blazed cold above, he said, "When Moran comes, we don't run. We fight together." She looked at him long, her heart caught between terror and fierce pride. "Together," she whispered. The prairie seemed quieter after the rustlers had been driven off, but it was the kind of quiet that carried weight, like the breath before a storm breaks. The widow Harper felt it every morning as she stepped into the orchard, her skirts brushing the grass, her eyes searching the horizon as though she expected to see riders cresting the ridge at any moment. Her nights were no easier. Sleep came slow, broken by the sound of coyotes howling or the wind slapping against the shutters like a fist. The young cowboy, though, moved as though he had found his place. He rose early, saddled the bay mare, and worked the land with a steady devotion that stirred something fierce and aching in the widow's chest. He spoke little of himself, but in his silence she learned him, his patience with the animals, the way he hummed low when mending fences, the tender care he showed in patching the orchard gate though his hands were blistered raw. One night she sat on the porch, lantern at her feet, watching him oil his rifle. The firelight painted his face in bronze, made him look older than his years. "You never told me your name," she said suddenly. He looked up, startled. "Name's Caleb." "Caleb," she repeated softly, letting it settle on her tongue. She realized she'd thought of him all this time as only the boy, the drifter, the cowboy. A name made him something else. Someone real. Someone she might lose. Shadows in town. The next week, Caleb rode into town alone for supplies. The widow had warned him not to linger, but he returned slower than usual, jaw tight, eyes hard. "What happened?" she asked as he unloaded the sacks of flour and oats. He didn't answer at first, Only after the chores were done did he sit at the table, voice low. Moran was there, in the saloon, laughing like he owned the place. Her stomach dropped. Did he see you? Oh, he saw me, Caleb said, his mouth a grim line. Looked me over, called me the widow's new pup. Said he'll come calling soon enough, and when he does, he'll take what he wants. Her hands tightened around the back of the chair. He always was a vulture, picking at grief. Then we won't give him carrion, Caleb said. We'll give him steel. She wanted to believe his fire would be enough. But she knew Moran, knew the cruelty that lit his eyes when he took something that wasn't his. A fragile warmth. The tension grew with each passing day, but so too did something softer. The widow found herself lingering at the table after meals, not rushing away from the silence that stretched between them. Caleb sometimes read from an old Bible he kept in his saddlebag, his voice slow and rough, the words wrapping the small kitchen in something steady, almost sacred. One evening, as rain pattered against the roof, she found herself watching him more closely than she should. The lamplight glinted on his damp hair, traced the line of his jaw, and she felt her breath hitch. He noticed her gaze. What is it? He asked. She shook her head quickly. Nothing. But the word was unconvincing, and her cheeks warmed under his steady eyes. After a moment, he leaned closer across the table. Ma'am, if I'm out of line, tell me, but I think of you more than I ought to. Her heart slammed against her ribs. You're too young, she whispered. Maybe, he admitted, but I'd rather be too young and alive with you than old and hollow without. For the first time, she didn't look away. She let the silence hold them. Let the rain blur the edges of the world outside, and though she did not reach for him, she didn't retreat either. The test of survival, their uneasy peace was broken when a drought settled over the valley. The creek thinned, the pasture turned brittle, and the orchard trees wilted under the burning sun. The widow had weathered lean years before, but never with danger lurking so close. Water became a fight of its own. Caleb rode miles to bring back barrels from a neighboring rancher, who owed the widow's husband a favor. He returned blistered and bone-tired, but with enough to keep the animals alive. One night, when he staggered into the kitchen, half delirious from heat and thirst, she forced him into a chair, pressed a cup of water to his lips. Fool boy, she scolded softly, though her voice trembled. You'll kill yourself trying to keep us alive. He smiled faintly, eyes half-lidded. Worth it. Her hands lingered too long on his shoulders. She felt the strength in him, the devotion, and something inside her cracked open. Whispers of justice by midsummer. Rumors spread thick. Moran's gang had robbed the bank in Cedar Ridge. 2 men lay dead. The sheriff had called for deputies, but none stepped forward. The widow heard it from Mrs. Haldeman at the store. Mark my words, he'll be here soon. Men like that always come back to where the blood is fresh. The widow rode home heavy-hearted. She found Caleb chopping wood by the barn, his shirt clinging to his back, sweat gleaming along his temple. When she told him, his axe split the log with a crack that echoed like gunfire. Then let him come, Caleb said. This land won't bow to him, neither will we. She wanted to believe his certainty, but she feared the cost. The skirt once more, that evening as she hung laundry on the line. The hot wind tugged at her skirts, pulling them high against her legs. She turned and found Caleb watching her, his gaze unguarded, raw. She raised a brow, half amused, half weary. Is your mind always on what's under my skirt? This time his answer came steady. Always. She laughed, but softly, the sound breaking like light through storm clouds. And what would you do if I let you? He stepped closer, careful, his voice low. Treat it like the only treasure I ever found worth keeping. For a long moment, their eyes locked. Then she turned away, heart hammering. Not tonight, she whispered. Not until we're safe. But she knew she was already his as much as he was hers. Betrayal in town days later, Caleb rode again into town for ammunition. When he returned, his face was darker than she'd ever seen. What is it? She asked. He slammed the box of cartridges on the table. The sheriff sold us out. I heard him talking to one of Moran's men. Said he'll look the other way when Moran comes. Said he won't risk his skin for yours. The widow's throat went dry. Then we're alone. Caleb met her eyes. We've been alone since the start. But alone doesn't mean beaten. Preparing for the reckoning that night, they worked side by side, cleaning rifles, stacking firewood, making sure the house was ready for siege if it came to that. The widow showed Caleb where her husband had hidden spare ammunition in the floorboards. Caleb showed her how to load quicker, how to breathe steady when aiming. In the small hours after the work was done, they sat together on the porch, exhaustion pressing them close. She rested her head against his shoulder, surprising them both. "You should have a girl your own age," she murmured. "Don't want one," he said simply. "Want you." She closed her eyes, torn between fear and longing. The first glimpse of Maranthe next dawn, dust rose on the horizon. Riders, 4 of them, paused at the ridge, too far to fire but close enough to be seen. One lifted a hand in mock salute. Even from the distance, the widow recognized the broad-shouldered silhouette of Jake Moran. Her blood turned to ice. Caleb's hand closed over hers, steadying her. "Soon," he said, "and when he comes, we'll end it." She nodded, though her heart pounded like a drum. The riders vanished into the dust, but their shadow lingered. The widow, Harper, and Caleb stood together on the porch long after the silhouettes disappeared, neither speaking, each listening to the silence with pounding hearts. The prairie lay wide and endless, but it suddenly felt small, hemmed in by the certainty of violence. That evening, the widow moved through the house with a strange calm, as though her body remembered a rhythm from years before, when she and her husband had braced themselves for storms. She checked shutters, set lanterns in every room, and laid out bandages on the kitchen table. Caleb watched her quietly, his jaw clenched, the weight of responsibility pressing on his young shoulders. "You're not afraid," he said finally. She paused, turned to him. "I am, but fear's no use unless it sharpens you. And I've learned to keep mine sharp," he nodded, as if taking her words like ammunition into his own soul. The widow's past revealed that night. Unable to sleep, she sat by the window, the lamplight soft against her face. Caleb came down from the loft, barefoot, drawn by her silence. "You knew Moran before?" he said, not as a question but a truth he had pieced together. Her hands tightened in her lap. "When my husband was alive, Moran came often. Pretended friendship, but his eyes gave him away. He wanted what wasn't his, and when he couldn't have it, he waited for weakness. The ambush was no chance raid, Caleb. He meant to take everything from me. Land, stock, even me." Caleb's breath came sharp through his nose. "And you've carried that alone." She met his eyes, weary but unbroken. What good would it do to tell it? No man in this town would raise his rifle against Moran, so I built my fences higher and I learned to sleep with a rifle by my bed. He reached across the space, his calloused hand covering hers. "You're not alone anymore." For a long moment, she let her hand rest beneath his, feeling the warmth of his palm seep into her skin, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of something more than endurance. Betrayal at the saloon 2 days later. Caleb returned to town for nails and salt. The saloon doors creaked as he stepped inside, dust clinging to his boots. He kept his hat low, but eyes turned toward him. Whispers rose low and sharp. At the back table, Sheriff Tom Kinney sat hunched, his badge dulled by years of inaction. Across from him lounged Jake Moran himself, broad-shouldered, scar along his jaw, his smile a viper's curl. "That's him," Moran said loud enough for the room to hear. "The widow's new pup." The room chuckled nervously, eyes darting between Caleb and Moran. The sheriff raised his hands as if to quiet the air, but his voice betrayed no strength. "Jake," Kinney muttered, "you keep your fight off my floor." Moran leaned back, boots on the table. "You keep your nose out of mine, Sheriff. We've got an understanding, don't we? You let me ride, I don't bring fire to your town." Caleb's blood boiled, but he held his tongue. He bought the nails, the salt, and walked out under the weight of a dozen staring eyes. But before he mounted his horse, Moran followed him onto the boardwalk. "You think you can take what I left behind?" Moran drawled. "The widow's mine. Always was. Your kind don't last out here. You'll die on her porch and she'll bury you same as the last one." Caleb's hand twitched near his revolver, but he forced himself still. "Then you'd best hope I'm not faster than you when the day comes." Moran's grin widened, cruel and certain. Oh, the day will come. Love in the shadow of war. When Caleb returned, the widow saw the storm in his eyes before he spoke. She set down the basket of apples she'd been sorting and stepped closer. "You saw him," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "And he promised he's coming for you." Her throat tightened. She reached for his arm without thinking, fingers curling against the sweat-damp fabric of his sleeve. "He'll kill you. Or I'll kill him," Caleb said, his voice steady. "Either way, he won't touch you." Her resolve cracked then, just enough to let the truth slip past her defenses. She lifted her hand to his cheek, rough with stubble, and whispered, You don't even know what you mean to me." He caught her wrist gently, pressing her palm closer to his skin. "I know enough." Their lips met, hesitant at first, then desperate, years of silence and restraint breaking in one long, shuddering kiss. The world outside faded, the dust, the threat, even the memory of grief. In that moment there was only the fire between them, the unspoken vow that neither would let go. When they parted, breathless, the widow pressed her forehead against his. "If we survive, Caleb, then you'll have what's under my skirt and everything else I am." He laughed softly, though his eyes shone. "Ma'am, that's more treasure than a poor cowboy like me ever hoped for." The reckoning begins. The next dawn, smoke rose on the southern horizon. A ranch had burned. Word came by rider before noon. Moran's gang had struck again, and this time they were heading north, toward Dry Creek, toward the widow's land. The townsfolk whispered of fleeing. The sheriff locked himself in his office. But the widow and Caleb stood in the yard, rifles ready, eyes fixed on the ridge. "You still with me?" Caleb asked, voice low. "To the end," she said, loading a cartridge with steady hands. The sound of hooves thundered closer. 6 riders crested the hill, dust rising behind them like a banner of war. Moran at their head, his eyes fixed on the house like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Caleb stepped forward, rifle leveled. The widow stood beside him, skirts whipping in the wind, her face carved from iron. "Harper," Moran shouted, his voice booming across the pasture. "Time to settle old debts. Send out the boy and what's yours is mine again." The widow raised her rifle, her voice carrying steady across the field. "You'll have to walk through fire and blood to touch me, Jake Moran. And I promise you, you won't leave standing." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. The first shot cracked the silence. The morning air shattered with gunfire. The stillness of the prairie was torn apart by the thunder of hooves, the whine of bullets, and the acrid stench of black powder rolling across Dry Creek like a storm cloud. Caleb fired first, dropping one of Moran's riders from the saddle. The man tumbled into the dust, his horse screaming as it bolted toward the hills. The widow fired next, her rifle cracked steady, her aim honed by years of solitude and survival. Her shot split the brim of another outlaw's hat, grazing his temple and sending him swerving wide. But Moran didn't flinch. He spurred his horse harder, a cruel smile splitting his face. His voice carried above the chaos, deep and mocking. "That all you've got, Harper? A boy in a barn for cover?" Caleb gritted his teeth, reloaded with practiced hands. "You'll eat those words," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The siege begins, the gang scattered, circling wide around the house. Bullets whined against the clapboard siding, shattered windows and splintered fence posts. Caleb pulled the widow back into the doorway just as a slug buried itself where she'd been standing. "Stay low," he barked, but his voice cracked with fear. Her eyes flashed. "I won't hide in my own house. Not from him." Together they crouched by the kitchen window, trading shots with the men outside. Glass rained down. Smoke stung their eyes, and the walls shook with the pounding of lead. For hours, it seemed. The fight raged. The outlaws hooted and jeered, firing blindly, testing the strength of the widow's defenses. But every time one pressed too close, Caleb's rifle barked or the widow's steady hand sent them diving for cover. Still, ammunition ran low. Caleb counted each cartridge, his heart sinking with the dwindling pile. Inside the storm between volleys, they huddled together in the shadows of the kitchen. Sweat trickled down Caleb's temple, his hands shaking as he reloaded. The widow's face was streaked with dust, her lips pressed tight, but her eyes burned with a fierce light. "We can't hold forever," he whispered. She touched his arm, firm. "We don't need forever, just long enough to break them." He looked at her then, truly looked. Not just at the determination in her face, but at the strength that had carried her through widowhood, loss, and loneliness. In that moment, he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, even with smoke staining her skin and blood trickling from a shallow cut on her cheek. "I swear, whatever happens," he said hoarsely, "I'd rather die beside you than live without you." Her breath caught. She leaned closer, pressed her lips against his with sudden, desperate heat. The kiss was fierce, hurried, the taste of fear and longing bound together. When they pulled apart, her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "Then fight with me, until the last breath." The fire Moran, growing impatient, changed his tactics. His men lit torches, hurling them onto the porch against the barn, into the dry grass that licked hungrily at flame. Smoke billowed, thick and choking. Caleb cursed, dragging a bucket from the pump. The widow joined him, beating at sparks with a wet blanket. But the fire spread fast, curling up the barn walls, spitting sparks onto the roof of the house. Moran's laughter rang across the field. "Burn, widow. Burn and come crawling out to me." The widow's heart hammered. She thought of her orchard, her land, the home she and her husband had built. Everything threatened to turn to ash in moments. But Caleb seized her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. The house doesn't matter. The land doesn't matter. You matter. If I have to drag you from the fire, I will." She blinked hard against the smoke, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt not alone but protected, the charge with the flames closing in. Caleb knew they couldn't stay penned inside. He grabbed the widow's rifle, checked the chamber, and looked to her. "We break out," he said, "straight through them. Better to die running than choking in smoke." She nodded, her jaw set. Together then, they burst from the doorway in a storm of smoke and gunfire. Caleb fired as he ran, cutting down another outlaw. The widow followed, her skirts catching cinders, her rifle steady. Moran roared and spurred his horse forward, his revolver flashing. Bullets tore into the ground near Caleb's feet. One clipped his shoulder, spinning him half around, but he stayed upright, teeth bared in pain. The widow screamed his name, raising her rifle. But Moran was too close. His pistol aimed square at her chest. Face to face, time seemed to slow. Caleb lunged, slamming his body against the widow, knocking her out of the bullet's path. The shot cracked, grazing his ribs, the burn white hot. He hit the ground hard, gasping. Moran dismounted, boots crunching in the dirt. His grin gleamed in the smoke. "Look at you." Boy bleeding out, widow helpless. "Should have been mine from the start, Harper." The widow rose, rifle in hand, fury blazing in her eyes. "You'll never have me." She pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. Moran laughed, drawing back his pistol. "Then you'll die empty-handed." But Caleb, coughing blood, raised his revolver from the dirt. With shaking hands, he fired once, twice. One shot went wide, but the second struck true, burying itself in Moran's chest. The outlaw staggered. Disbelief etched across his face. He dropped his pistol, hands clawing at the wound, then fell into the dust with a grunt that carried no triumph. The field went silent. His men, seeing their leader fall, broke. Some fled into the smoke, others dropped their weapons and rode hard for the hills. Aftermath. The widow dropped beside Caleb, pressing her hands against his bleeding side. "Don't you dare leave me now," she whispered, her voice shaking. He managed a faint smile, eyes half closed. "Wasn't my mind on your skirt that time, ma'am. Just on keeping you alive." Tears streaked through the soot on her cheeks. She pressed her lips to his forehead. "Stay with me. We've come too far to end here." Smoke still curled around them. The barn collapsed in flames, but the house, though battered and scorched, still stood. The widow's land had survived, and with it, perhaps, her chance at something new. The prairie was hushed the morning after the fire and the gunfight, as though the land itself paused to breathe after so much blood and smoke. The air carried the acrid tang of charred wood, the faint sweetness of apple blossoms scorched in the orchard, and beneath it all the heavy silence of death. The widow Harper moved slowly through her yard, her black skirts dragging through the dust, her hands trembling though her face was carved from stone. Behind her, on the porch, Caleb lay on a pallet she had hastily made from blankets and straw. His shirt was stained dark with blood, his breath shallow but steady. She had worked through the night, pressing cloth to his wound, cleaning it as best she could, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since her husband was alive. Now, as dawn spread pale light across Dry Creek, she stood still at the edge of the ruined barn and let the truth sink in. They had survived. Moran was dead, his men scattered like crows after the shot, and yet survival came at a cost she could barely bring herself to name. The boy, the man, the only one who had stood beside her when all others had turned away, lay broken inside her house. The town comes calling be midday. The townsfolk arrived. Wagons creaked up the road, horses stamping nervously, men and women climbing down with wide eyes at the sight of the smoldering ruins. Mrs. Haldeman pressed a hand to her mouth. "Lord above, you held them off alone?" "Not alone," the widow said, her voice quiet but steady. She looked toward the porch where Caleb stirred faintly. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Men who had whispered in fear at the saloon now spoke with awe, some with shame. The sheriff, his badge dulled and useless, finally rode up last, his eyes downcast. "Couldn't stop him," he muttered. The widow's gaze cut sharp as a blade. "Wouldn't stop him. There's a difference," he flinched. But no man in the crowd challenged her words, for they all knew it was true. Tending the wounded, the doctor came by wagon, an old man with spectacles and a bag that smelled of alcohol and herbs. He cleaned Caleb's wound, stitched it with careful hands while the widow held his head, whispering comfort through his fevered groans. "He's young," the doctor said at last, packing his tools away. "That's in his favor. But he'll need rest and more care than most can give. He'll live if he wants to." "He wants to," the widow said fiercely. "He damn well better." When the doctor left, the widow sat beside Caleb, brushing sweat-soaked hair from his brow. His eyelids fluttered and his voice rasped low. "Did we win?" She bent close, pressing her lips to his temple. "We won. He'll never touch me again." A faint smile tugged at his lips before sleep claimed him. Transformation days passed in a slow, aching rhythm. The widow rose at dawn, tended the stock that survived, hauled water to douse the last embers of the barn. Then she returned to Caleb's side, coaxing him to drink, wiping his forehead, reading from the Bible in a voice softer than she remembered she could summon. The town changed, too. Men who once turned their eyes away now offered help, rebuilding fences, lending lumber to patch the barn, bringing bread and salted meat. Some from guilt, some from admiration, all recognizing that the widow had stood braver than any of them. Whispers followed. But they were different now. "The widow's no longer alone," they said. "The boy saved her. She saved him. Maybe that's what it takes to make new life out here." The skirt, once more, one evening as the sun dipped low and the cicadas sang. Caleb stirred more strongly. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but insistent. "You remember," he murmured. "What you promised me, if we survived?" Her cheeks warmed despite herself. "You fool boy. Even with half your blood gone, your mind's still on what's under my skirt." His laugh was a ragged whisper. "Always." She bent and kissed him, slow and lingering. "Then know this. What's under my skirt and everything else I am belongs to you now. Not because you saved me, but because you loved me when I was nothing but ashes." His hand trembled as it brushed her cheek, but his smile was strong enough to melt the last of her defenses. Redemption as summer deepened, Caleb's strength returned. He limped at first, leaning on a crutch, but each day he walked farther across the yard, his shoulders broad against the sky. The widow walked with him, her skirt swaying, her face softened by something she had not worn in years. Hope. One Sunday, they rode into town together. The people parted for them on the boardwalk, eyes wide, whispers following. The sheriff tipped his hat but dared not meet their gaze. Mrs. Haldeman, once so quick with scorn, pressed a loaf of warm bread into the widow's hands and murmured, "You're stronger than all of us, and he's the kind of man we need more of." The widow only nodded, but her hand slipped into Caleb's as they walked. The simple gesture felt like a declaration greater than any speech. The horizon, months later, the barn stood rebuilt, stronger than before. The orchard bore fruit again, and laughter, real laughter, echoed across Dry Creek for the first time in years. The widow still wore black sometimes, for grief never vanished entirely. But when Caleb teased her, when he brushed a kiss against her temple as he came in from the fields, she found herself smiling more than frowning, living more than remembering. And one evening, as they stood together watching the sun sink into the horizon, she whispered, "You've given me back more than I ever thought I'd have again." Caleb slid his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "And you've given me more than I ever thought I deserved." They kissed as the sky burned red and gold, their shadows stretching long across the prairie, two figures bound by survival, justice, and love. The end.